Well, he may not be a wartime president, but he's perfect for this crisis. I'm Scott Otta, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, a writer over at Politico.com, one Zachary Karabell, has a piece where he basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that only a rhino like Trump could get the economy through this COVID-19 crisis. Now, where Mr. Karabell may have meant this as an insult, I think he's not altogether incorrect. And I wanted to see what you think about this, because we acknowledged up front, pretty much everybody, even those who voted for him, that we weren't getting an ideological conservative when we voted for Donald Trump. And in fact, what we did get was a guy who has a high comfort level with being highly leveraged. And now, in this crisis, what Mr. Karabell is arguing in Politico is that what we need more than anything is for the federal government to spend like crazy. And Donald Trump is just the guy for the job. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot to say about that. First of all, a couple days ago, it was the first time I think ever that I've made my right angle thumbnail well in advance of when we actually shot the right angle thumbnail, but we're shooting those today. And the reason I bring that up is I made a little image of Trump, an engraving of Trump on $1 million bill, and I titled it "The War President." And I think that is absolutely apt for him. And I'll get to this gentleman's criticisms in just a moment. The reason I decided to go with that was I watched his daily press conference on the virus just a few days ago. And I was struck by how elevated he seemed. The thing about war presidents is it's almost never, I don't know that we've ever elected a president in the middle of a war, a different president, changed presidents in the middle of a war except Johnson in Vietnam. But, and Eisenhower in Korea, so much for that theory. But anyway.
Neither declared wars, though.
Right. What I'm trying to say is this. There are qualities to certain presidents that become elevated in a kind of a crisis, and Trump has declared that this is a war on the coronavirus, on COVID-19. Once again, I'm usually against the overuse of that term, but in this case, I think it's appropriate. It's an enemy we're facing. It's taking thousands, tens of thousands of lives. It's going to take hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives around the world. And I consider that to be an appropriate metaphor for what we're doing here. But the thing that struck me the most about that press conference was, I wrote when I posted that picture, I said, I liked Trump before and I thought he was doing a good job. Now I think he's just magnificent. I thought he was magnificent that day anyway. And the reason that I felt that was twofold. First of all, he was free with praise for Mayor Cuomo and Mayor Newsom. I'm sorry, Governor Cuomo and Governor Newsom. In fact, for Mayor Bill de Blasio, who's been excoriating him on a daily basis, and said that they're doing great jobs and they're working real hard and doing the best they can, and he's real proud of them. That comes after both Cuomo and Newsom saying, no, the president's really doing a good job on this. That led me to this feeling of bipartisanship and unity, and a sense that we were now dealing with something so serious that we could put petty politics aside. And as soon as I finished that show, about 20 minutes later, they had the vote, and Nancy Pelosi had the COVID relief bill killed because it didn't provide enough funding for Planned Parenthood and green initiatives and all the rest of this stuff. So one reason I think that he's rising to the occasion as a war president is he seems to be much more. He seems a little less petty about things. I think that his natural combativeness is now facing like a worthy opponent, something worthy of it, and he just struck me as just being much more serene, much more serious, much more succinct. And again, I thought he was doing a good job before.
Now, Bill, this author, while you're addressing things that are of importance in this situation, this author's really not addressing his character, his demeanor,
I know,
his carriage.
Talking about the money.
He's specifically talking about Trump's ease at spending money, and that he came into office with none of that sort of deficit hawk, the old days of republicanism when there used to be people who were really concerned about overspending.
Right. So I said there were two reasons why I thought he was magnificent and why I thought he was a war president. That was the first one. The second reason is that when I was watching him at that last press conference, he struck me as somebody who was no longer a politician, not familiar with politics. He struck me more than anything as a chief executive officer who had a very serious problem to solve, had put together a good team of people, was letting them do their jobs, and was basically using his influence to move resources into the areas where they were needed the most. He was functioning like a CEO. He wasn't functioning like a politician. And he was prepared to spend whatever money needed to be spent. And the entire feeling that I got was that for once, not just the wheels of government were moving faster, but all of the resources of the private sector in terms of drive-through screenings at Walmart and Target, all the rest. So now to the spending issue. When you have a businessman become president, it doesn't happen too often. They're almost always politicians prior to. But he has a fundamental outside the box thinking in terms of the power of the private sector and getting other companies to manufacture respirators and all the rest of that stuff. So the question is, should he be spending this money, and would a conservative, a fiscal conservative, hawk conservative, be spending this kind of money? And I think the answer to the first question is definitely yes, and I think the answer to the second question is likely yes. To the degree that I do my best, the two of us do our best to kind of define what conservatism is in a classical sense. Conservatism is not the belief in no government. It's the belief in limited government, the smallest possible government, and government that does things that only a government can do and that no one else can do better. And to me, this is exactly what a government is for, precisely exactly what a government is for. And this is what the Treasury is for.
Karabell says, by the way, at a time like this, we're all socialists now.
Did he say that?
Yes.
What made him say that?
In a crisis, we're all socialists. He said Bernie Sanders, who has no chance now of becoming president of the United States, would approve of this massive spending. And he kind of ticks off a laundry list, Bill, of things that Republicans are now okay with. Money for nothing, just sending checks to people like Andrew Yang was recommending when he was struggling to get 1% in the polls in the Democratic primary. Cash to companies to keep people on payroll, no foreclosures, no evictions, student loan deferrals, and a bunch of other things. He says we're not at federal, controlled healthcare yet, but we'll get there if this crisis lingers on. So basically, he's saying our principles go out the window when we're faced with a crisis like this.
What an absolute idiot! I mean, I never ever fail to be amazed at the ability of people like this to see every single signal on the table and get it exactly backwards. We are all capitalists now. This isn't money that the government is keeping so that the government can open more clinics and distribute more healthcare through the government. All of this stuff is to bail out the private sector and to keep the private sector humming. All of this is for capitalist purposes, because the difference between this and anything prior to COVID-19, handing out checks to people while the economy is booming, is a bad idea. A very bad idea. All it does is foster more dependency on the government. But we don't have an economic crisis, and we certainly don't have a crisis of people not being willing to go to jobs. We have a situation where there's a humming economy with record low unemployment, tremendous economic growth, and all of a sudden people who are working are not allowed to go to work in jobs that already exist. We're not all socialists now. We're all capitalists now, idiot. How hard is this to see?
I read another article, Bill, related to that topic where the guy was making the case to say, look, the reason why Democrats, in some cases, are opposed to the kind of a bill that was being floated for this COVID-19 relief was because there's only upside and no downside for the corporations that are receiving either direct subsidies or loan guarantees or loans from the federal government. He was basically saying, look, we don't have to do any of that stuff. The Federal Reserve has already said that it would buy up as much debt, even corporate debt, as it had to keep the economy going. So handing over cash to these people, where if they crash, if these companies crash, then the taxpayer eats the loss. But if they succeed, in many cases, they don't even have to pay the taxpayers back with interest. They just pocket the profits.
I'll come back to that in a second. The main thrust of this bill, of this spending bill, is to provide money for people who are out of work and who need to be able to buy food and pay rent and so on. And the entire thrust of this bill is designed to keep small businesses afloat. Big businesses are not in any danger of going out of business, no matter what the airlines say or whatever General Motors says. There's going to be a General Motors in an airline after this is over. But there may or may not be a Little Tony's Italian restaurant in North Hollywood, depending on how long this thing lasts. This thing is targeted at small businesses, and it's a check to the individual American workers, and it's not a check to them for doing nothing. It's not incentive for them to do nothing. It's not a government bailout for them to do nothing. It is a crisis management situation where the federal government is putting money into the private sector in order to basically keep the economy alive while we essentially shut it down from the outside in order to save lives. So there's that. Now, as far as corporate repayment goes, there is an argument definitely to be made that we need to take a look at how this money is spent, and that there needs to be an accountability for how that money is spent, but that accountability comes after the money is spent and not before. To the degree that we're talking about things where airlines or whatever other companies may have in the past couple years or 5 years or 10 years spent revenues that profits basically, companies taken a profit, they use that profit to buy up their own stock to raise the value of their shares. To the degree that a company is sitting on a lot of its own money in forms of shares in its own company that it owns, then that company should have to sell those shares and raise money that way. And to the degree that I don't think we should be rewarding companies for buying up their own shares, being cash poor in a crisis, handing them a stack of money, and then allowing them to keep doing that, or allow them to keep their shares in that case. I don't think that's appropriate. I think what we really ought to do is very simple. I think there ought to be an accounting, and I could write this rider to the bill. I could write it in a paragraph. It basically would say something to the effect of, we're going to issue this money now. And when this is over, we're going to take a look at the books. And if it turns out you took money that you didn't need because you have reserves of stock in that amount or whatever, then we're going to demand that money back. And we'll do it after this crisis is over and not before. And we're not going to stop the money coming before.
That phrase you keep using, and you've used it in several shows now, I think is going to mystify some people. Because let's say you were a farmer and you had a bad crop and you were in desperate need of cash, and you went to the local bank and said, hey, I need $10,000 to buy seed for the planting in this next season. The bank wouldn't say, hey, here's the $10,000. We'll talk later about how you're going to pay it back. They'd write that into the loan up front. So why not treat businesses that way as well? As you said, it's just a paragraph in the bill. How much extra effort would it take? But you keep insisting on accounting for this after the fact.
Yes. So what are we going to do, Scott? Are we going to first of all, let's just cut to the chase here. Let's just cut right to the chase. This is a chance. This is the cover that they're using, in my opinion, because they want to get their green energy requirements. They want to get their funding for Planned Parenthood and all the rest of it. So this whole thing about
that's stipulated, but I'll grant you that. But I don't understand why you keep saying after the fact we'll arrange for whether or not you're going to repay this loan.
Well, I just think that at the moment, well, how are you going to? I don't think I understand the criticism then in that case. Are you saying that he's saying that this money is basically just going with no strings attached, and that there's no accountability for it whatsoever, and that the corporations are going to take the lion's share of what this relief for the American workers is for? Is that what he's saying?
That's the other article, not the Zachary Karabell piece. But yeah, the other article that I was reading was essentially saying that, and many other articles have been saying that. But Karabell's point is, hey, if you want a president who's going to spend money like mad, President Trump's your guy, because he was never an ideological conservative anyway, and so he's perfect for this time. He's being somewhat snarky about that, but on the same token, he's thinking, well, it's better that we don't have a real conservative in there.
All right, well, let's just deal with each one of those things at the same time. If I go to the hospital, I'm not talking about COVID-19, I'm just talking about I don't feel good. I go to the hospital, I'm not feeling good. They hand me an insurance form. I have to sit there and fill out the insurance form. I have to get out my driver's license, figure out what the number is, write all that stuff down. I have to do all of that stuff. That's what I have to do if I go to the hospital and I've got a bad stomach, or I've thrown up, or I have flu-like symptoms or whatever. If I get hit by a bus and I'm unconscious, I don't have to go through all those things. You know why? because I'm on death's door, that's why. So what will happen in a case like that is that the emergency room patient will be taken directly to the emergency room. That person will then be given whatever care is necessary to save their life. And when that life has been saved, then you have a discussion about how it's going to be paid for, whether he was insured or not. Nobody gets left at the door of an emergency room because they can't fill out an insurance form or they don't have an insurance card. People get treated in an emergency as the need for their treatment is stacked.
And in that setting, Bill, I think that's a reasonable argument, but we don't have anybody unconscious here, and we've been spending weeks dickering over this bill.
Really? We don't have anybody unconscious here? We don't have an economy?
Which CEO of which corporation do you find to be non-responsive and in comatose?
Scott, we're not talking, Scott, maybe I should slow down because I know you're always playing a liberal, and sometimes I take that for granted. A metaphor is a story that's used to illustrate a larger point. And the reason they call it a metaphor and not an example or a case study is because you're trying to illustrate a point by making a small story leap into a bigger story. So when I say that the patient comes in unconscious and needs to be rushed to the emergency room, I'm not talking about individual shareholders of companies. Those are actual people, and they seem to be fine in terms of the health is concerned. What I'm talking about when I talk about a patient needing emergency care is the entire economy, not the people who run the companies. I'm talking about the entire economy, including the people who don't have the money or are rapidly facing a situation where they don't have the money to pay for their groceries.
And I get that.
Hope that helps you quite a bit.
I don't think that's unreasonable. What I'm saying is they've spent weeks fiddling around with this bill. They voted it down twice, and it's, I'm sure it's thousands of pages by now. I don't see why somebody couldn't have said, by the way, any corporation that takes federal money will pay that back if they continue to exist afterward with interest to the taxpayer. How hard is that?
I don't think it's hard at all. I don't think it's hard at all. And I don't think that's why the bill went down.
No, I don't think so either.
Okay, so why don't we talk about why the bill went down? Instead of this, oh, it's all going to go to the fat cat story. I can't really defend this bill until I really see what percentage of the total money allocated is designed for small businesses, because I think we can all agree that the guy who's running the corner restaurant or the convenience store hasn't taken millions of dollars of fat profits and invested them in his own stock. So I don't think we're really dealing with them. I think we're dealing with what we're talking about is relief for companies that are small businesses across the entire country, and arguing about this stuff at this point and using it as a fig leaf to deny the relief that the American people need is just plain chicanery, plain and simple. It's just that. And by the way, why don't we think about, in terms of after the fact, this would be a useful function for, I don't know, a free and independent press to handle or something along those lines. Something like that. I think this would be an interesting case for an actual news story. If you found that a company was sitting on a lot of stock and a lot of cash, took bailout money, kept it, didn't sell their stock, whether or not there was a provision for legal action against it, you could make a story about that would wreck that company basically forever. So why don't we worry about all of this bullshit later? And for now, can we please just get this money approved so that the people who are out there who are really, really worried about food supplies and basics like that, paying electric bills, all of it, why don't we worry about that now? And for them to be complaining about things like mortgage relief and all the rest of this stuff, that's ridiculous. So finally, to the actual initial point here about a rhino versus a fiscal conservative, I would describe myself as a fiscal conservative. And I think this money absolutely needs to be spent. I think that's why we have a federal treasury. I don't think there's any question in my mind whatsoever that the purpose of a government is to protect its people, to keep its people alive. Handing out money to companies that are failing is not conservatism. Handing out money to companies that need money because they have been shut down by government edict in order to protect the public health during a crisis like this, which has not occurred in a century, that to me is emergency spending on the part of a government, which is exactly why you need governments. If we were talking about handing out checks to people who didn't want to go to work or weren't going to work, had no interest in going to work, I'd be very much against it. But we're talking about checks to workers and to employers, most of which are small companies, small businesses. It's got nothing to do with this democratic argument at all, nothing to do with them. And we're talking about doing this not because these people don't want to work and not because the business is failing. It's because the government has told people you cannot go to work. You are legally prohibited, at least in my state, from going to work. And you are certainly advised not to go to work if you want to save American lives. That's what this is to me. This is wartime spending. And I'm not aware that our debt was ever higher than it was during World War II. It might be now. But without question, during World War II, the federal government went incredibly into debt in order to win that war. And after the war was over, they sorted it out with things like government bonds. If you want to introduce bonds or something like that, that's fine. It's just people don't have money to invest in groceries right now, let alone in treasury bonds or things of that nature. So I'm willing to go with all of this stuff. But the problem is you can't just put a line in there that says we will do a thorough accounting of this after the fact, because if you could put that sentence in there, it would be in there. We know that's not how it works. We know that's not legalese. We know that's not how things are in a bill that's probably 1,000 pages long. That simple one sentence proviso that I just included there is something that would probably run for 100 pages. And I'm saying that the need at this point is demonstrably outweighing whatever potential downside there may be to this in terms of companies that are getting a bailout money getting even richer. I think after 2008, we could see pretty plainly that Ford didn't take the bailout money and that General Motors did and so on. So we can hold these people accountable. But the entire argument that we're making in terms of the corporate fat cats is a non-argument, because that's not why the Democrats oppose the bill. It's just not. We know why they don't oppose the bill. And so in terms of, do I think that we would have been better with a true fiscal conservative in the White House? I don't see how a true fiscal conservative would do anything much different than this. I really genuinely don't. I cannot imagine a conservative. I can't imagine Ronald Reagan. I can't imagine any other conservative, true blue conservative saying, no, let people die, and we're going to prevent people from going to work because of a public health need, but we're not going to do anything to compensate them in any way whatsoever. We're just not. Too bad for them. We've legally prevented them from going to work, and now we're going to do it. Look, if it was laissez-faire capitalism, which I am generally in favor of, greatly in favor of, but I think there are times when it does need some regulation, then laissez-faire capitalism would simply say, well, if you want to have 100 people on your staff, and you want to bring them in, who are we as the government to tell you what to do? And if those 100 people come in and one of them's infected and the all 100 get affected and they go and infect another 100 people each, well, too bad. I don't believe that. Not in a crisis like this, and especially not in a non-economic crisis. We're talking about an economic Band-Aid for a problem that's not an economic problem. So I don't consider this a bailout at all. A bailout to me is something, at least in the terms we're used to it, bailout is having the taxpayers pay for businesses that are failing. And these businesses were not failing before this virus arrived. And therefore, I think the entire set of circumstances is completely different.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are grateful to the people who have made these conversations, nay, let's call them what they are, scrimmages, possible because of their contributions at BillWhittle.com. They went to the website, they clicked that Become a Member link, and they're contributing on a monthly or annual basis.
And I need to say this again. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I need to say this. I do. I'm going to say it anyway. Folks, you have to understand the entire purpose of the show is to defend these ideas against the kind of criticism that they get in the news all the time. Scott Ott is an ideological martyr. He really is. He is so good at pressing the point that I want to punch him sometimes, and I am paying him to do this on your behalf,
and to
so
be
that
clear,
you can see that these ideas.
I've had several offers recently on mostly YouTube comments, not from our own members, several offers to punch me in the throat because of the comments that I make on this show. And as we've explained to those people, and Bill has just explained to you there, I'm not pretending to be a liberal or a progressive. What I'm doing is trying to give the arguments of the other side their full weight and significance, to give them the benefit of the doubt that they are not acting in bad faith, and to avoid caricaturing them, but basically present those arguments in a way that they would if they could state them as clearly as we can, and give Bill an opportunity to deal with those arguments as they are.
Right. So what we're trying to provide to you on the show is we're trying to provide the argument and then the rebuttal to the counter-argument, both of those things. It's the entire reason we have the show in this format, and I just wanted to say that again because it's a dirty job that Scotty's doing.
And this
real dirty job.
These steel collar stays should prevent any throat punches from disabling me and from the swift completion of my appointed rounds. We're grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.